The afternoon sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Cathedral, casting colorful patterns across the rows of white roses and expectant faces. 26-year-old Sarah Bennett sat in her elegant wedding gown at the altar, her blonde hair perfectly styled beneath a delicate veil, waiting for her fiancé to appear. The guests had been seated for over an hour. The string quartet had played through their entire repertoire twice. The priest, Father Michael, stood patiently at the altar, occasionally glancing toward the vestry door, where the groom should have emerged long ago. Sarah's hands trembled as she held her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. She had dreamed of this moment since childhood, imagining herself walking down this very aisle to marry the man she loved. But as the minutes stretched into an eternity, a cold certainty began to settle in her chest. Her maid of honor, Jessica, knelt beside her with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, honey, maybe we should call his phone again." Sarah shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is not coming, Jessica. I can feel it." At that moment, Sarah's father approached the altar with a grim expression. He had been making quiet phone calls from the church vestibule, trying to reach the absent groom or anyone who might know where he was. "Sarah, sweetheart," her father said gently, "I spoke with David's best man. David left a message saying he could not go through with the wedding. He said he was not ready for marriage and needed time to think." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. 200 guests watched in stunned silence as she covered her face with her hands, her carefully applied makeup mixing with tears of humiliation and heartbreak. David Sterling, the successful investment banker she had been with for 3 years, had abandoned her at the altar without even the courtesy of a face-to-face explanation. The man she had trusted with her future had disappeared at the moment when she needed him most. Father Michael stepped forward with compassion in his voice. "My dear congregation, it appears there will be no wedding today. Let us remember that sometimes life takes unexpected turns and our faith is tested in ways we do not anticipate. Please keep Sarah and David in your prayers during this difficult time." Sarah stood slowly, her elegant gown feeling like a costume for a play that had been cancelled mid-performance. The whispers of sympathy and shock from the guests felt like a roar in her ears as she walked down the aisle that should have led to her new life, but instead led only to heartbreak and uncertainty. 5 years passed. Sarah had rebuilt her life piece by piece after that devastating day. She had channeled her pain into purpose, using the money that would have gone toward her honeymoon to start a non-profit organization that helped abandoned and at-risk children find stable homes and supportive families. Her organization Second Chances Foundation had grown from a small local initiative into a nationally recognized charity that had helped thousands of children. Sarah had discovered that her greatest strength lay not in being someone's wife, but in being an advocate for those who had no voice. On this particular autumn evening, Sarah was attending a charity gala at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. As the executive director of Second Chances Foundation, she had been invited to speak about their work and to accept a humanitarian award for her contributions to child welfare. Sarah wore a simple but elegant navy dress, her blonde hair now shorter and styled with the confidence of a woman who had found her purpose. The scared abandoned bride of 5 years ago had been transformed into a poised, successful woman who commanded respect in boardrooms and legislative halls. As Sarah mingled with donors and supporters before her speech, she felt a familiar presence behind her. She turned slowly and her breath caught in her throat. David Sterling stood just a few feet away, looking exactly as she remembered him, but somehow smaller. He wore an expensive tuxedo and carried himself with the same arrogance that had once attracted her, but now seemed hollow and unappealing. "Sarah," David said, his voice uncertain for perhaps the first time since she had known him. "I heard you were going to be here tonight. I wanted to talk to you." Sarah studied the man who had once held her entire future in his hands. "Hello, David. What brings you to a children's charity event? This does not seem like your usual crowd." David's face flushed slightly. "I wanted to see you." I have been following your work with the Foundation. You have accomplished incredible things. Thank you, Sarah replied calmly. It has been fulfilling work, much more meaningful than planning weddings that never happen. David winced at her words. Sarah, about that day, I need you to know that you need me to know what, David? Sarah interrupted, her voice steady but firm. That you were young and scared. That you made a mistake? That you have regretted it every day since? David nodded eagerly. Yes, exactly. I was terrified of the commitment of changing my life. I handled it badly and I have thought about you constantly ever since. Sarah looked at him with the clarity that comes from years of growth and self-discovery. David, you did not handle it badly. You handled it exactly as you meant to. You made a choice that day and that choice revealed who you truly are. But Sarah, I want to make it up to you. I want to try again. I am ready now for marriage, for the life we plan together. Sarah felt a mixture of sadness and liberation as she looked at this man who had once defined her dreams. David, the woman you left at that altar, no longer exists. She was someone who believed her worth was tied to being chosen by you. The woman standing here today knows her worth has nothing to do with being chosen by anyone. David's expression grew desperate. But we were good together. We could be good together again. I have more money now, more success. I could give you everything you ever wanted. Sarah smiled, not with bitterness, but with genuine pity for this man who still did not understand what he had lost. David, you could never give me what I wanted most. What was that? David asked, confused. The ability to trust someone completely, Sarah replied. You took that from me on our wedding day, and I had to rebuild it myself. The life I have now is built on a foundation you could never provide because you already proved you will run when things become difficult. At that moment, the gala coordinator approached to let Sarah know it was time for her speech. As she prepared to leave, David grabbed her arm gently. Sarah, please, can we at least have dinner? Can we talk about this more? Sarah looked down at his hand on her arm, then back at his face. David, I forgive you for what you did, not for your sake, but for mine. But I will never trust you again. And without trust, there is no foundation for anything meaningful. Sarah walked away from David Sterling for the second time in her life, but this time she was the one doing the leaving. As she took the stage to accept her humanitarian award, she looked out at an audience of people who valued her work, her dedication, and her strength. 5 years ago, Sarah began her speech. I experienced what felt like the worst day of my life. I was publicly humiliated and abandoned at a moment when I was most vulnerable. But today I stand before you to say that sometimes our greatest disasters become our greatest gifts. She paused, seeing David in the audience, his face a mixture of regret and admiration. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. When life takes away what you thought you wanted, pay attention to what it gives you instead. My abandoned wedding led me to abandon children, and in helping them find homes, I found my true home within myself. The audience erupted in applause. But Sarah was thinking about the scared young woman in the wedding dress who had cried at that altar 5 years ago. That woman had needed David Sterling to validate her worth. The woman standing here today knew her worth was not dependent on anyone's approval or presence. After the gala, Sarah drove home to her comfortable apartment, which was filled with photos of the children her foundation had helped, letters from grateful families, and awards recognizing her humanitarian work. She had built a life of purpose and meaning, surrounded by people who valued her contributions to the world. David Sterling had given her the greatest gift possible by abandoning her at that altar. He had forced her to discover that she did not need to be chosen by someone else to have value. She could choose herself. And that choice had led to a life far richer than any marriage to him could have provided. Sometimes Sarah reflected as she prepared for bed. The worst thing that happens to us is actually the best thing in disguise. David's abandonment had felt like the end of her story, but it had actually been the beginning of her real life. The life where she was the author of her own happiness rather than a supporting character in someone else's drama. The woman who had once waited at an altar for a man who never came had become a woman who never waited for anyone to give her permission to live fully. And that transformation was worth more than any wedding ring could ever